Hello, I'm Jim Cornwall, and this is the WalkingPost.com podcast. WalkingPost.com is the news website dedicated to walking, with all the latest on books, trails, festivals, gear, events, health, fitness, and more. This podcast is number 51, and it's going live on May the 8th. The village has calmed down after the elections here in Scotland yesterday, and as the polling station is right opposite my house, it was pretty noisy. Not with the people, but with my dog barking at them all. I think he was telling them all to vote for the Border Terrier Party, most likely. One of the ballots had 17 different parties to vote from. I didn't even know we had that many. Let's just get to May the 8th. Given yesterday was an election, perhaps it's appropriate that today is World Donkey Day. And I appreciate it doesn't apply to all politicians, admittedly. It's Free Trade Day, No Socks Day, which is also appropriate because I'm not wearing any. It's Red Cross Day, and it's the day in 1970 that the Beatles released their last album, Let It Be. For births, we have former President Harry Truman, the great David Attenborough, and a lot of musicians from Keith Jarrett to Alex Van Halen. If it's your birthday, maybe learn an instrument. Last week, the subject was the Ice Age Trail in Wisconsin. This week, we're still in the US, just a little further north, because we're talking with Expeditions Alaska's Carl Donohue. Before we do get going, if you do have news, guest ideas, or even subjects to cover, or comments, or if you want to advertise, please do get in touch at walkingpost.com, or you can just email me at jim@walkingpost.com. Okay, let's go through some of the headlines of the news articles you may have missed that we had on Walking Post this past week. We had an article about women not having enough time to go for a walk, Blackstrap launched new clothing, and there was an article on ticks. An outdoor adventure platform is seeing growth in women-only adventure travel. A new walking leaflet celebrates the 50th anniversary of the Viking Way, which starts at the southern side of the Humber Bridge, and there's a new 80-kilometre long-distance trail in northeast Brazil. A trail in British Columbia, Canada is set to reopen. Plans were approved for a shared walking and cycling path in Kenilworth, and you can read all of these and more at walkingpost.com. Okay, let's get to this week's conversation. A state that a lot of people would like to visit is Alaska. Maybe they wouldn't be so keen in the middle of January, but it's definitely a state with lots to see, lots of wilderness and lots of hiking trails. To tell us about hiking in Alaska, our guest today has a ton of experience in the state, and if you have your eyes or feet on visiting for hiking, this is a great introduction to some of the places you might want to go, and also to some of the common mistakes people make about hiking there. Carl Donohue runs Expeditions Alaska, so let's find out some more. Hi Carl, thanks a lot for being with us today, and I'm really interested to learn more about hiking in Alaska. So maybe first you could tell me a bit about the company.
I was living in Atlanta, Georgia at the time, and I had started coming up to Alaska and spending the summer and the fall here backpacking and guiding for some people and just taking people out in various different parts of the state. And then I started my own company guiding for myself there, Expeditions Alaska. That was 2002. And for about the first 10 years, I would come up from Atlanta and spend the months here. And it was just me. I was the only person. I did the website, I did the bookings, I did the emails, and I did all the guiding and all those kind of things. And it just kind of one thing led to another, and it gradually grew. And forth, I got now to the point where I've got somebody who helps out with the office work, and we've got somebody who manages gear and equipment for us. And we've got anywhere from 8 to 10 guides who work with us during the summertime. And we run a bunch of trips all over the state, backpacking and hiking. We do some other activities as well, water-based trips, especially kayaking and rafting and those kind of things, some photography tours. But the bulk of what we do is remote backcountry backpacking trips.
All right. What's the season there? I mean, how long are you able to work?
It's a pretty short season. For where we go, access is pretty limited. We fly in a bush plane to where we start our trip from, and most of those places are not open for the planes to come in till mid-June. Some of them we can get in a little before that, earlier June, some of them not till late June, like we do a couple of trips in the Arctic, where we won't book anything there till about the 25th or so of June because the pilots can't get in and land on the lake. The lake's still frozen or something like that. So that's kind of the big driver of when the season can start. And then on the back end, we go through the rest of June, then July and August. And then once we get into September, we start running on the other side of that where you start having snow again and that kind of stuff. It's not yet winter, but it's enough of a thing that the air taxis won't fly, if they can't land and that kind of thing. It doesn't take much snow on the ground for a plane to not want to land there if it's on a remote gravel bar or something like that. These trips are pretty short to start with. So you put some snow on it and they don't like landing there. So that's kind of the governor parameter on the back end. So I would say most of those trips we finish by about September 10th. Usually we're done. Sometimes we'll run a trip a little bit longer than that, but it's usually around then.
Right. And what are some of the more popular places? There's a lot of wilderness and a lot of national parks there. So what are the popular places for hiking?
Yeah, the ones that we see the most visitation to would be Gates of the Arctic National Park, which is up in the north and northwest part of the state. For whatever reason, it's definitely become the busiest one. It's probably the least visited park of all the parks, or one of them. But for backpacking, it seems to get a lot of attention. A lot of people want to go hiking there, and so that's probably the most popular one. The next one for us would be Wrangell-St. Elias National Park, which is on the east side of the state. It abuts Canadian border. And that, the one we've been operating in the longest, that's where I started out. The other national parks, we go to Lake Clark or Katmai. We go to Denali National Park. That's probably the most popular park in the state. For just regular hiking, there's a lot of day hiking and the stuff right around Anchorage and the Chugach State Park and the Kenai Peninsula. There's a lot of great trails and stuff down there as well.
For the hikes that you do, how many do you typically take in a group? And could you tell me about the hikes that you do, how long they are, how tough they are?
For the backcountry, we kind of keep groups pretty small. We typically will keep a maximum limit of 5 guests and a guide on a trip. There's a little bit of wiggle room on that, so sometimes we'll do 6 or something. I think one time we did a group of 8 with 2 guides where the 8 all knew each other and they were traveling together, and we had 2 guides on that trip. But generally, we like to keep it small. We don't like seeing big groups of people out there when we're out there, so we try to sort of operate by that standard ourselves. So 5 is a pretty good number we've found to make it work. Sometimes it'll be smaller than that. We'll have 4 people or something for the group size. As far as the difficulty, it's all over the map. We do a variety of different types of trips. We do a base camp trip, so we'll fly in somewhere, we set up a camp nearby there, and then we just do different day hikes and stuff from there where we're not moving camp each day, we're just doing a hike here and there. And then we do backpacking trips where we fly in and get dropped off, and we have a route that we have to go to get to another place to get picked up, or a loop that we might come back to. But usually it's a point A to point B type of hike, 6 days to 10, 12 days. And then we do what we call a base pack, which is kind of a combination between those two. So we fly in and we do a base camp for a couple of days to another spot. We do a couple of days there, and then we get picked up. Those in the base camps are usually about 5 days long, something like that. But the backpacks are generally longer. We do some trips here that are pretty challenging for just about anybody. And then we do some other trips where the base camp trips and even a couple of the backpacking trips that are pretty doable for probably just about anybody, I think. So long as they can walk and the mobility is okay, they should be fine for. But it's one thing that I have learned a lot, to try to define what difficult is such a gray area, like somebody will come along and do a route that we think is moderate, and for them it'll be the hardest thing that they've ever imagined doing ever. And then other people come along and say, well, that wasn't so bad. That bell curve of kind of human performance is very real. you know So yeah, it's hard to sort of have an objective measurement for how difficult something is. And the other sort of big factor on that for what we do, all these trips are where there's no trail. So we get dropped off somewhere and we hike through whatever the terrain kind of throws at us, whether it's open tundra, which might be easy to walk on, or it might be a glacier, it might be some steep side hill on a mountain, it might be some brush or boulder fields and talus and scree and rock and all that kind of stuff. And those terrain challenges are what cause difficulty. If they're not a well-balanced walker, they'll struggle. Even if the mileage and the elevation loss or gain is not very significant, just struggling on the terrain will probably be the biggest factor for most people, if they're not used to that kind of walking.
How do you accommodate or take into account different levels, even within a group of 5 people? If you did a 10-mile hike, you might get somebody that can do that 10 miles in 2 hours, and then another person that can do it in 5 hours. How do you accommodate those different skill levels?
Yeah, that's definitely something, we sort of see that. So it's a lot of stopping and waiting for people, and as a guide, you've got to learn to you only move as fast as the slowest person in the group. And you have to pay attention to when you're stopping and you're waiting and people start catching up one by one, you've got to wait for that last person to catch up and then let them have a rest on top of that. It's tempting to sort of wait till that person catches up and then you get moving. You got to wait and let them get a rest. And the big one there, honestly, is managing people's thermostat. So telling people when we stop to wait for somebody that even though you're not cold, layer up a little bit when you stop, because you're going to have to wait for 10 minutes for that person to get here and then give them a 10-minute spell and stuff. And you'll cool down pretty quickly when you stop moving, Managing that is probably the biggest part of it. And then the other part is setting expectations for people before a trip, that we are real clear to everybody that even though this is a group of usually different people signed up, it's not usually a group of people who know each other traveling together. So they're all individuals maybe on the trip. It's not an individual trip, it's a group trip, and everybody has to sort of have that mindset of accommodating best we can the different abilities and so forth for different people, So it's not usually too much of a factor if people have the right expectation going into that, I think, There's definitely been a couple over the years that we've all had where like, oh, this is pretty tough, because somebody is really fast and somebody else, and they want to just hustle, and somebody else is really struggling, and there's not anything you can do. You can't compromise. You can't meet in the middle on that. You can only go as slow as the slowest person can go, and everybody else has to deal with it.
What are some of your favorite places in Alaska for hiking?
Top of that list, and that's a long list, is Wrangell-St. Elias National Park. It's about an 8-hour drive east from Anchorage, and then it's mostly fly in to different places there. And it's just a really, really raw primordial landscape. It's just these big jagged mountains. And so you end up like right in the thick of some of the coolest landscapes anywhere. And it's really diverse terrain, and it's got its challenges for sure, but everywhere up here does. But it's just got a really strong mix of different types of walking that you do on even our shorter trips there. You've got stretches where you're cruising along doing 3 miles an hour, and then you're doing barely 1 mile an hour just because of the terrain and stuff. And the landscape is phenomenal there. So that would be my favorite place. Gates of the Arctic would probably be the second favorite. It's a close second. It's pretty awesome. It's really wide open country there, and so you get to really cover some ground if the footing is good and see a lot. And you just got this open sense of space in the Arctic that's really neat too.
And what about wildlife? I mean, everybody thinks of Alaska as being a wildlife haven. Do you see a lot, or is it a myth that you'll see, 10 bears every 5 miles?
Yeah, it's something that I understand why people come here with that. It's a little bit misplaced. We're fortunate here that we've got a lot of the cool animals that have been here forever, and they're fortunately still here or have been brought back here and reintroduced. So we've got muskox and we've got moose and caribou and bears and all these things that are really neat to see. But the population densities of those animals is a lot lower generally than people expect it to be. We're in the Arctic. I mean, my yard, it's May here. My yard just got clear of snow this week, and I'm in Anchorage. So if you go up into the Arctic and get a little bit of elevation, I'm at sea level, there's snow on the ground for another month at least. And that means the growing season hasn't started yet. So that growing season is shorter than now backpacking season. The growing season is that short, then the food supply is pretty short, and it's a long winter till those animals get a good supply of food again. So the population densities are a lot lower than people think. And once you get into these big places like gates of the Arctic National Park or the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge or something, there's really cool species of animals there that you might get to see, but they're few and far between. Sometimes we get really lucky and we cross where a caribou migration is coming through that pass or across the river or something. We'll see 1,000 caribou come by or something like that, which is pretty amazing, And if you're really lucky, you'll see 70,000 caribou come by. But those things are few and far between. Most of the time, it's on a 10-day trip, we might see a couple of bears, we might see a moose, we might see a caribou or a doll sheep if we're up in the mountains or something like that, but we're not seeing, it's not the Serengeti, and the big difference there is just the growing season. It's a short season that the sun comes out and things grow and things eat. And then after that, it's snow and they scrounge around looking for how to stay warm.
Do you do things like, obviously there's hiking, but do you do specialist things like photography tours or filming tours, that kind of thing?
Yeah, so I'm a photographer from way back. So I do a number of photo tours, and we go over to Katmai National Park and we photograph the brown bears there. And there's definitely a higher population density in that area because of the salmon runs. And we try to time our arrival at those creeks and salmon streams and stuff where the bears all congregate there. So we might, on a photo tour, we might see 40 bears in a week. We might see them every day, right? But they're all right there feeding in that 3-4 week window. And then once the salmon have moved off, those bears will move off, and you could come back to that spot, a month later and not see very many bears there at all. The other one that's kind of a funny thing on the bear tour is like, what else can we photograph? What other kind of animals might we see? And I say, if there's 40 bears walking around here in this area, there's not going to be a whole lot of any other animal out there, right? The mortality rate on calves for moose in the area is pretty high, so there's not a whole lot of moose or other animals in areas where you've got a really heavy concentration of bears. You're not going to see a whole lot of other animals there at all. But so, yeah, we do bear tours, we do some bald eagle photo tours, we do northern lights, so we'll go out in the fall, and then in the spring or March is a good time for the northern lights and do the photography for that stuff. But all the hiking stuff is in the summer. Sometimes we'll do a snowshoe trip, so we'll stay in a cabin somewhere and go snowshoeing every day in the wintertime. But there's not a lot of people looking to come to Alaska in the wintertime, so that's not really on their radar.
With all of the photography tours and the bears and other animals, how do you manage the environmental aspect of things where you don't want to disturb the environment or get in the way of the bears or disturb the wildlife?
Yeah, I think the most I've learned about doing that is from watching bears themselves or other animals, and sort of take a leaf out of their book and try to operate like they do. You try to be quiet. You're not making a lot of commotion. You're not making a lot of activity or anything. So being still and quiet is probably the most important thing, in my opinion, being around when we're in close proximity to those animals. That's how they typically act, unless they're getting in a squabble or something like that, but usually they're pretty mellow. They walk along and take the time, and they're not making a whole lot of commotion. Most animals are pretty conservative in their energy and so forth, and that's what they're used to. And so if we act like that, it seems they learn fairly quickly that if we're not a threat, that they can just ignore us and go about their day, and we're not going to cause any problems to them at all.
For people that aren't from Alaska, that go up there maybe from the south or from different places, what are the things that they either don't know about or don't think about that you have to remind them of when they get into that different environment?
Yeah, that's kind of a lot of things there, and it depends a little on the type of trip somebody's doing, right? If they're doing a fly-in trip somewhere, and there's lots of trips you can do here in Alaska where you don't take a bush plane, you can just hike from a trailhead or something like that, you know. But if they're doing a fly-in trip somewhere, the biggest thing is just logistics and how those work when you get into remote places like the Arctic. Plus, when you're dealing with bush planes and what their limitations are, it's not what you're used to. And one of the most common questions we get once we've got people scheduled on a trip is like, what time is the flight scheduled for? And I'm like, what time? It's scheduled for Friday. You know, and if we're lucky, knock on wood, it'll go on Friday, but we don't have a time for it. Like the air taxi will figure that out on the day with all the things that have changed their schedule the day before or the day before that or whatever, plus with what the weather is doing and all those kind of things. We might be leaving at 10 o'clock in the morning. We might be leaving at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. We might not be leaving till the next day. If they can't fly, they can't fly, you know? So that's also going to be the same case on the back end with when you get picked up and flown out of the backcountry. So just forgetting the idea of having sort of a structured plan. You've got obviously your points of contact there that you got to get picked up and dropped off and so forth, but there's got to be a lot of fluidity in your structure of your hiking and all that sort of thing to accommodate that. We've had trips where the pilot said, hey, this is going on. If you want us to get you out, we're going to have to come get you a day early. So if you want to be, obviously you do want to be picked up there and get flown out, you've got to be there a day early. You've got to make sure that if you think this is a 5-day hike, that you schedule it over 6 days or something like that, maybe even 7 days, and give yourself a big cushion in your own itinerary so that when those other things happen and those other pieces start to move around, you can still accommodate what you're trying to do from point A to point B. And that's just with the plane. Then as well as that, you've got people's ability to move or whatever. You got variables in the terrain. You got river crossings, which are probably the biggest one that people are not used to doing. A lot of people that are used to hiking on trails, they don't think about what that means when we say there's no trails here, we're hiking off trail. They think you hike around off trail where the walking is good, and then when the walking gets gnarly, you get back on the trail. Like there is no trail. So it's whatever the terrain is, how difficult it is, whatever, that's what you walk on. And one of those things is when you come to a river, there's no bridge, there's no walkway, there's no anything. You have to deal with the river. And those rivers, especially up here in the Arctic and glacier-fed rivers, they can fluctuate a lot. I've seen a river drop by like 2 feet in a day. So when we got to it, it was waist deep and really fast. There was no way in the world we were going to cross that river. And we waited. We just sat there and waited, and the river dropped down, and then we got across. I've also seen rivers go up by that much. So you've got these really big landscapes where the watersheds are really much bigger than people imagine. We did a trip a couple of years ago. We were boating, so we were set up for that. But we camped somewhere, and we got a little bit of rain that night, but not very much at all. Like just a little bit of rain for an hour or two, real light rain. And we got up in the morning. I couldn't believe my eyes when I looked at the river. It had come up by well over 2 feet and was just muddy, turgid, like it was a roiling river. And it was because they had that much rain way up the watershed that, the river had come up a lot in a really short period of time. We had no reason at all to believe it was going to be like that in the morning. So when you run into that, when you got river crossings and so forth with hiking, that's a big deal. So I would say, in answer to your question, the 3 things are logistics with dealing with air taxis, and what all that means, and the flexibility that you have to build into your schedule. River crossings are a lot bigger risk and significant sort of factor to pay attention to than what people expect. 2 more. I would say one is the risk of hypothermia is just much bigger here, even when you've got pretty good weather. The permafrost is right under the ground, so when you stop and you sit down and you're on the ground, it's cold. and you get cold. And then when the sun gets behind a ridge or something like that, the heat's gone. It's surprising how quickly you cool down in those situations. So just being ahead of that, and you can manage it very easily if you pay attention to what you're doing and just put your jacket on, all those sorts of things while you're still warm. It's a very manageable thing, but that's a more significant thing than people expect it to be. And then the last one is just distances and how difficult hiking can be. People are used to walking on trails where they might do 15 miles in a day or something like that and be fairly comfortable with that. When you take that trail away and you have to navigate through the mountains without a trail, that 15 miles in a day might be 3 days. It might be 4 days. Like it's not uncommon to average about a mile an hour when you're hiking. So if you're going to hike for 6 hours of hiking in a day, which when you're backpacking, that's a pretty significant amount of walking when you're backpacking. You could expect to probably cover 6 miles that day. By the time you factor in your breaks and all those kinds of things, it doesn't seem like a lot, but if you're doing 10-mile days, you're moving pretty well here.
Where do you get people coming in from on your tours? I assume that they're not locals, they're probably from other places.
Yeah, we get very few Alaska locals. We get some. We've had a few over the years, but not very many. Most of the people come up from the lower 48, what we call it outside, so not in Alaska. We get a good number of Europeans come over. The big factor that seems to determine that most of the time is just the value of the dollar, and the value of the euro and those kind of things. So it's like what's the currency rates? If it's in their favor, we get more people from Europe. If it's not in their favor, we get much fewer people. The last few years, we've seen a definite decline in interest in coming over here from Europe for a whole bunch of reasons. We've had people from South America. We've had people from Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, parts of Asia. We've had Southeast Asia. So it's a pretty broad mix, but the majority of them would be from the lower 48 states here.
And over the years that you've been doing this, what have been some of the highlights, any memorable incidents that you can tell me about?
Yeah, I think most of them that stand out to me are, again, related to that fluidity that you have to have in adjusting to things because things change. And we'll have, we talk about plan A, you've got plan B. I'm like, when we're down at plan JKLMNOP, that's probably what's going to happen, And it's just because there's a lot of moving parts when you're trying to get dropped off with a bush plane here and then hike over to this spot. There was one time we were to do a trip and we'd scheduled to fly into this one strip and get dropped off and traverse across a glacier. And the pilot told us when we arrived, it was out of Yakutat. And when we arrived there, the pilot said, hey, we're probably not going to be able to get you to that strip that we were talking about getting there. There's still a lot of snow on it. So we'll drop you somewhere else. And I said, well, where else? He said, well, we'll just have a look and see what we find. So he took us and ended up dropping us probably 25 or 30 miles from where we had planned to start. I'll sort of preface this with, that was with a group of clients and guests on the trip who I'd done trips with before, and I knew them and their experience, and they're good hikers, so I had a lot more confidence in their ability to kind of do whatever it might come our way. And we had a pretty long trip there, so we had if you've got a 12-day trip, you've also got a little bit more time to make up some stuff. But so he dropped us, and we had 25 miles of walking to get to where we thought we were going to start from in our first thing. And we didn't have a map of that area. I'd flown over some of it before, and I knew the general, like we had to head east and intersect our previously planned route. We had to cross a glacier. We had a bunch of thick brush and that bushwhacking to do to get there. It was pretty arduous, but it was pretty cool. And it's also not that unusual. We had a trip in the Arctic with one of the guides 2 or 3 years ago where the bush plane couldn't get them. They missed the first 2 days of the trip because of weather. They couldn't fly in, so they waited it out. And then when he did fly them in, they couldn't go get dropped where they'd planned on getting dropped. So he dropped them at another spot but they didn't have, because we'd lost time, they didn't have time to get from that spot to another spot. So the pilot literally just took a piece of paper out of his plane and drew a map on it for the guide and described it to him. And these days, too, with inReaches and some of the satellite technology that we have, the guy was able to reach out to me, and I could look on the satellite imagery here and say, give him some directions and stuff. And they pulled that off, and he had a great 6-day trip that ended up at a spot he'd not planned on ending up at, and navigated the route. And that's the kind of thing that, one, you've got to have a good guide, and then two, that kind of thing is not for everybody. Somebody going out on that trip who's got a different mindset to that kind of rigidity can be uncomfortable with that. Those are not things that happen every year, every week, right? I mean, so I don't mean to sound like that, but those things definitely can happen. Last year has an even bigger example. We had a trip going to the Arctic. They were supposed to fly out of Fairbanks, and they waited there because of weather. They waited for a day and a half and still couldn't go. And we talked to the pilot that was in the Arctic, and he said, even if you're able to get here now, I don't think I could get you in anywhere in the next week. And so the guide called me. I was in the office here in Anchorage, and the guide called me and said, what should we do here? And I said, well, let me look around the state and find some good weather. It was when we had that big typhoon I don't know if you heard about that, but it was just horrible weather in the fall last year. And I said, hey, it looks like it's pretty good over in Wrangell-St. Elias. Can you get your clients back to Anchorage? We've got a van here. And he talked to the clients, and they said yes. So we flew them to Anchorage, put them in the van, drove them to Wrangell-St. Elias, and they did one of our routes called the Goat Trail. Had stellar weather for the whole thing. I laughed with one of the guests later on. I said, when you got dropped at the start of the Goat Trail, you were almost 1,000 miles away from where you had originally planned to start hiking up in the Arctic there. That was a pretty big pivot to pull off and do that. So for me, most of the logistics, most of the memorable things are those kind of things, which are probably not walking related. They're probably more my focus too now these days, because I'm running a bigger business and we got all this stuff going on. So those are the things that stand out. But yeah, that's kind of a big part of it. And I would sort of say that to, if any of your listeners are looking at coming to Alaska, that is one of the biggest things to understand, is that you can have all the best intention of plan A, kind of doing this route and that, but the best thing you can do in preparing yourself for that is to look at other options and have a whole bunch of other options available in the back of your mind that you might have to pull from or piece together to make something else work. As far as on the ground hiking, probably river crossings. We've had a couple of pretty dicey river crossings over the years, and with these glacier rivers, they're super cold. We've crossed rivers where you're watching the water come out of the bottom of the ice. There's the glacier and the river comes right out of it. So it's probably like 35 degrees Fahrenheit. So it's cold and fast, and you can't see anything through it. It's just that silty brown turgid water. You can't see anything, so you can't even really tell a lot of the times how deep it is till you get in it and test it. And you get in it, and it's up to your waist, and it's moving fast, and you got a pack on. And yeah, we've had a couple that we've turned around on. And well, back in 2022 we did one that I tried to cross this river probably 4 times. I had 3 guests with me, and I tried different spots. I'd look for where the river was braided or looked like it might be more manageable, and I would walk out into it. And each time I'd get to a point, I'm like, no, this is not a good idea, So I turned around, came back, and I'm pretty comfortable in the water. I swim and do all that sort of stuff. And so being in the river is not a big threat to me, but it's just, you have so little margin for error when you're in icy cold water that's fast and it's got rocks and all this sort of stuff. So better to be safe. And we came back and we tried another spot and we tried another spot. We ended up walking up the river about 5 or 6 miles to where the river came out of the glacier. And we got up on the moraine and the glacier around it, and then came back down. Took us just over a day. And it was pretty hard hiking, getting up on the glacial moraine and walking over the rocks and all this sort of stuff. It was pretty hard going for part of it. We ran into a grizzly bear along the way, and that spooked some people. And so it was a bit of an adventure just doing that part of our route. And then we came back down the next day, and we come down the river and we stopped for lunch. And one of the people said, man, that was a pretty hard day. And I said, and you remember where we were yesterday? And she looks around, she goes, we were right there. And it's like, yeah, we were just across the river. We're directly across the river from where we're sitting eating lunch. Yesterday, we were just there. And since then, we'd all walked our tails off going all the way up and around this thing, like many miles and pretty challenging terrain, everything, just to get literally that 50-yard gap across that river there. But it was a good call. It was a good hike, but it was a good call to do that and not have somebody upside down in the water than the alternative. So, yeah, it was. It was pretty funny to sit there and be like, yeah, we were right there, you know.
I suppose the
Yeah.
worst part would have been to have looked across and the water was, 3 feet lower and you could have just hiked across. And that would have been
Yeah,
annoying.
you know, and that's always potential, especially in the morning on those glacier rivers like that. In the evening, when the temperature does drop down at night, all that melt water, it doesn't disappear overnight, but it can drop down significantly overnight just because the cooler temperature and the melt water drops a little bit, you know. But that's also just part of it. And I said to some people on another trip where we had that kind of thing, I said, it's better to make a safe call on that than have to deal with somebody in their pack upside down and all the kind of drama that ensues. People worry a lot about coming to Alaska for bears. You know, that's the sort of the scare factor thing for them. But rivers are the much bigger risk for backpackers here. Negotiating rivers is definitely a bigger risk factor.
In the wintertime, do you lead hikes in other states or is it more you do the business stuff in the winter?
No, I do some photo tour stuff here in the winter, the Northern Lights and those kind of things, and some wildlife stuff. I went down to Patagonia last year, did some photography down there, and we'll be going back there in the future for photography as well as some hiking down there. One of the guides that works for us has started a thing down in Patagonia guiding down there as well. So we'll go down there in the off season and hook up with him. One of the other guides this year just went to New Zealand and he was there for 3 months and put together a couple of routes that I'm really excited about putting that together and getting on the website. And so we'll start trying to do some stuff and probably more in the southern hemisphere because it's our off season, so we can work here and do our stuff here in the summer, and then in their summer we can go down there and run some trips, whether that's in Patagonia or Australia or New Zealand and maybe the Himalayas. I did a trip to the Himalayas January last year, and so we're up in the Ladakh area, Karakoram, so in the western part of the Himalayas, and it was pretty spectacular. So I'm itching to get back and do something there as well.
I have seen lots of material about Alaska in the past, and it always seems so inviting with the mountains and the forests and the rivers, and I've always wanted to go there, but it's one of the few states that I've not actually been to. Of course, the reality of the situation is a little bit different, so it was nice to hear about some of the potential issues that there could be if you go there. So maybe a great reason for hiring a guide or going with a company like Expeditions Alaska. There are 2 time zones in Alaska because the Aleutian Islands, some of which are actually further west than New Zealand, have their own time zone. The reality is that there are really 3 time zones because Hyder, Alaska, which has a population of less than 50, is connected by road only to Stewart in BC, or British Columbia in Canada. And that comparatively is huge because it's got a population of more than 500, although there is no Tim Hortons. So for practical reasons, Hyder observes Pacific time, like British Columbia, rather than the official Alaska time. A little bit of trivia there. So that will just about do it for this week. The forecast for this weekend is now good, so it may have changed again within the next 6 hours. So it does mean that we might be out hiking or filming or photographing, or none of the above, who knows. If you do have news or suggestions for podcast guests, please do get in touch through jim@walkingpost.com. And as I mention every week, we are always looking for guests, whether it's about a new trail, a walking festival, a new book, or someone that's done an amazing walk somewhere in the world. So I hope you enjoyed this week's walkingpost.com podcast, and I hope you have a great week ahead. hopefully with a walk somewhere, regardless of the time zone, or maybe even across two of them. Until next time, happy trails! Walking Post from walkingpost.com is an Air Coastal Media Limited production.